What does it mean to be free? What does it mean to loose the fetters of injustice? When I was in seminary in Chicago, I was in the basement of the seminary having a conversation with another student, and I don't remember what decision I was trying to make. I only remember being stunned when he said, "Do what you want. You're free, white, and 21. Free, white, and 21. I had never heard the phrase before, and he could not believe that I had never heard that phrase before. He had heard it all his life. That statement of privilege, the right to do what you want, granted by the status of being white and being an adult. South of the seminary, I had an African American friend whom I would later marry. She also had an expression of freedom that I had never heard before, and she can state it better than I.
I don't have to do nothing but be black and die.
The first phrase is about the freedom to act, and the second phrase is about the freedom not to follow orders. Though both of these phrases grew up in separate parts of American culture, they both recognize the limitations of freedom. The first recognizes social status as a prerequisite for action, and the second claims freedom despite the limitations of social status. It adds that even if we had complete social freedom, it would still be limited by our death. And both of these statements avoid responsibility. They are cultural expressions saying, I don't have to answer to anybody. They are contrasted by a phrase from the book of Genesis. One of the most profound questions that we have to ask ourselves. Am I my brother's keeper? In the context of the story, clearly Cain was responsible for the death of Abel. But was he responsible for his life? Are we our brothers and sisters' keepers? Well, in one sense of the word, no. For 400 years, those who were free, white, and 21 were the literal keepers of those who had to be black and die. Slave owners often perceived themselves as caretakers for the people of the African continent. Slavery was resisted in both the South and the North because there was questions, even asked by Unitarian ministers of the day, whether slaves could handle freedom. The idea that we can keep somebody in any sense of the word, the idea that we know what is best for them, whether they're a family member, a friend, is often fraught with arrogance and is often self-serving. Slavery was just one example of how difficult it is to negotiate the issues of freedom and slavery. Can we ever be free from our nation's legacy of slavery? And what is the responsibility of whites and blacks and others to build a better future in this country? our nation right now is in serious trouble. We're facing a financial crisis. And even that crisis is not separate from our legacy of racism and slavery. Some are pointing their fingers at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, two stereotypically nicknamed banking institutions that were designed to expand the housing market to those who had been excluded. So I've heard it said on blogs that the problem was that we were lending to blacks and Hispanics. And that just stuns me. And then I think of the responsibility of blacks and Hispanics with the history of America saying, well, gee, if the man is offering to buy me a house, maybe it's too good to be true. And some of these loans were too good to be true because they were made by people who knew that the government would bail them out, even as they left homeowners struggling. Those people who took the loans, bundled them and sold them and resold them, others borrowing money at the rate of 30 times their asset. See, now, if I was buying a home at 30 times my assets, I mean, the church pays me around $60,000 a year. 60 times 30 is 6 times 3 is 1,800, and it's about a $1.8 million home, or is it an $18 million home? I can't do the math. And I'm sure none of these Fannie Mae loans were done at a 30-to-1 ratio. Like Bear Stearns was overextended. I think that the people who had the most freedom are probably the most responsible for the mess that we're in. Those who had the power to write the rules are more responsible than those who followed those ill-written laws. We now have a system of privatized profit and socialized risk that benefits those at the top of the social structure and harms those at the bottom. But the sins of the financiers are similar to our own. Whenever you point the finger, you have 3 pointing back at you. And I confess that I'm part of the common human sin. We all want the freedom to do what we want, and we want to hold others responsible when our efforts fail. How do we negotiate through this minefield of freedom and responsibility? I propose the following. We are responsible to recognize where we are dependent. Only then are we free to act independently. And this creates the harmony of interdependence. I'm going to repeat that. We are responsible to recognize where we are dependent. Only then are we free to act independently, thus creating the harmony of interdependence. First, let us look at where we are dependent. We are dependent upon life itself. We cannot make free choices if we are not alive. And none of us chose to be here. If you have a teenager, they may remind you of that. And none of us can choose to live forever. The responsibility to honor our father and mother is set forth in the Ten Commandments. It recognizes that our freedom depends on life itself. And furthermore, since our freedom depends on that life itself, we are responsible to preserve our lives. Eating right, exercise, avoiding communicable disease is a starting point. If we do not take care of ourselves, our freedom will be diminished. And then furthermore, we are dependent upon others. Therefore, we are responsible to others. Theoretically, I am free to make love to whomever I choose. Realistically, I need permission from another person. Theoretically, I can drive my car wherever I want. That freedom is dependent upon other people building the car, building the road, drilling for oil, refining it, and bringing it to the station. And I am acutely aware that I am responsible for paying all those people upon whom my freedom to drive is dependent. My freedom to drive is also impaired if there is oncoming traffic in my lane. It is the responsibility of every driver to agree with the rules which enhance our freedom. Once we recognize our dependence upon each other, our freedom is enhanced. If our highways were deregulated, we'd face the chaos that we have in our financial system. We are dependent upon history and thus responsible to acknowledge it. I think Molly Ivins wrote a book, said, "Dance with the ones that brung you." I cannot choose not to be white. Some people might note that I sometimes choose not to be adult, but I must accept the social baggage that comes with being white. It is my responsibility to recognize the history of white racism. If I ignore that history, I am bound to repeat it. Only when I am responsible enough to realize that where I am now is dependent upon what has been done before can I make free choices to change. Only by recognizing prejudice can I resist being white and prejudiced when I make my choices. And then after I make my choices, I need to let go of how my choices are received. Throw myself into the mix of humanity and hope for a change. This is where interdependence comes in. I hope in the upcoming weeks, each of you vote for the person you think is going to be best to be president. But we have no control of whether we are part of 49% or part of 51%. But we have that responsibility and that freedom to make our voice heard. Not everyone will choose the way I do, the way you do. But may their disagreement strengthen our arguments, and may hatred engender compassion. We are free to make a choice, but we are not always free about the consequences of our choice. Once a consequence comes back to us, then we are responsible to recognize it. We are dependent upon others to give us feedback. And we are called to react to what has been given us. We either react habitually or unconsciously, or we choose to act freely and independently. But once acting, we have to let it go. We do not control what comes before or after. To be responsible is to be able to respond. Freedom is deciding how we will respond. Freedom and responsibility are intertwined, they are interdependent. So often, we respond unthinkingly. We respond to anger and slander by offering our own slander and anger. And we can observe politicians getting wrapped and trapped in this cycle of mudslinging. In our lives, we often find ourselves in these personal cycles, traps of mudslinging, whether it be with a family member or a friend or a coworker. And only by recognizing that we are in that trap are we able to make a free choice. And then once making a choice, we let go of our freedom and prepare to respond to the consequences of our choices. We have inherited a world we did not make. We drink from vineyards we did not plant. We are faced with choices about love, war, faith, wealth, race, and more. Will we choose to respond or surrender our freedom to the status quo? How do we take what we're given and figure out some way to give? Let us be responsible to recognize where we are dependent, then act freely and independently, and enter into the dance of interdependence. You are now free to speak. And I hope you take the responsibility to help me avoid the awkward silence of waiting for you to speak. Hello. Are we on here? I think we are, yes. You use without opinions. Who says there aren't miracles? How do you manage your freedom and your responsibility?
In listening to your talk, I was struck by a very simple thing, it seems to me, and that is the precept that if we do unto others as we wish to be done to ourselves, then a lot of the greed and the bottom line mentality would perhaps be mitigated.
I think in your sermon, the thing that struck me was the statement you said that we are living in a world that we did not make. And it's interesting how a lot of the things that we live in were not choices. They weren't conscious choices, like the way the roads are set up are not conscious choices. And being in the world that we live in, we can look at those things and make the choices about them the way they should be or the way we think they should be. And that is a great responsibility on our part to better the things that we were given. when we accept them.
This is my own pet peeve and my regional thing, that the roads east of the Appalachian Mountains are based on the decisions of deer who were followed by Native Americans, who were followed by European Americans. Once crossing the Appalachian, the roads kind of are laid out in squares, and it's much more easy to get around. So,
there's a famous movie line, a wealthy man gets up in front of a crowd of stockholders and said, "Greed is good." I don't think greed is good, but I do think greed is inevitable. We all have ambitions and greeds of our own, and one of the things that we've experienced over the last 10 or 20 years is the thought that there's no such thing as a good regulation. There's no such thing as an appropriate tax, and I think not so much that greed is bad, but that we're learning the consequences of that attitude. We need guidance, we need rules, we need social pressures, and we need laws.
This discussion is very important to me right now. I'm trying to decide to make up my mind to go work at the polls for Barack, and I live in Walnut Cove, and I'm a newcomer there, and it's scary. Because I know, how my neighbors are, but I want to face my fears, and it's an opportunity too. Thank you.
and people are free to work in any poll for any party. We accept all people here.
And all polls. Somewhere in here, and I can't find it quickly enough, I know there's a reading in the back that ends with that the beating of my heart should hurt no one. And it's something that really resonates with me. It's that whatever I do, that my life and the way I live it shouldn't create harm in anyone else. And so when I'm talking to people, or when I'm listening to people who are talking about, I have the freedom to do what I want, or it's a free country, and in terms of religion especially, that, I can believe whatever it is that I want to believe because it's a free country. And I have to say, but does your religion hurt someone? And that's kind of, I'm trying to use that as my moral compass.
If we expect to maintain our own freedom, we have to also make sure that everybody else maintains their freedom. But having freedom doesn't mean getting a free pass. We also have to all hold each other responsible for what we do with our freedom.
I think we're all kind of in a process about this because I remember when I was a kid and my mother would say, "You make me so angry." And I just would take that on as like this tremendous burden of, I must be the most horrible child in the world because I've made my mother angry. In adulthood, after many, many years of therapy, I realized, I'm really not that powerful. I can't make her do anything. And so I think a lot of times we do get really tripped up by our egos about what we actually can do. And sometimes it's really dependent on what people choose to give us the influence for. And I am just really grateful that a lot of you all became psychotherapists. So.
Let us continue on and celebrate our faith, the faith of the larger liberty, the title that says we're free and then the rest of the song telling us what we have to do because of that. Hymn number 287. Please rise as you are able.